LEGO Star Wars: The Skywalker Saga is a game I was looking forward to ever since the first teaser in 2019. So when it came out in April last year, I immediately started playing, but after a couple of hours I had mixed feelings that only deteriorated over time.
Wow, let me at it.
There were a lot of jokes, missions and mechanics that didn't really do it for me. I gave the game a short break and after some days completed it for the first time, but still didn't enjoy many parts of it. I then looked at reviews to see what the general consensus was, and most of them were very positive towards the game. The game was applauded by many as it rekindled their nostalgic love for the old games, but some of these reviews make me question if they actually played the game they're reviewing. How does anyone in their right mind compare this to It Takes Two? This game might actually be one of the worst big budget co-op games out there. And apparently some consider it to be the best LEGO game ever made. I want to challenge that notion, because I think a lot of reviews are severely superficial and miss a majority of this game's fundamental issues. I find the Skywalker Saga to be quite terrible in many key aspects. It tries very hard to reinvent the LEGO formula, and while some are improvements on the old and outdated systems, they make up only a small percentage of the changes. Many of them are presented like improvements, but either fall back on the old systems or are flat out worse. There are also a lot of new additions, with some being understandable if you want to modernize LEGO games, but others going from bafflingly useless to infuriatingly dysfunctional and disruptive. Regarding its story, the game fails equally and does a poor job of conveying it in both cutscenes and gameplay. The gameplay is to the other LEGO games what the Chinese backstroke of the West bootleg is to Revenge of the Sith, only without the unintended comedy.
The geography that I stands compares you superior. He is in my behind.
It's a bastardized version of a once decent thing that had much room for improvement. And instead of plugging up some holes and making clever changes, this game tries so hard to be inventive that it changes things that didn't need changing. There are nuggets of great ideas to be found in this game, but unfortunately they are buried under the heavy weight of its issues. Before I go into further detail on the gameplay, I would like to address the elephant in the room when discussing this game, that being its troubled production. I don't envy the developers of this game for a second. From everything publicly available, it seems like working for TT Games was very taxing. Blackmail, forced overtime, low morale, and crunch were among the common problems many of the studio's departments faced. With that being said, knowing why things don't work as intended or are flawed in other ways doesn't magically not make them issues. It might change your outlook on them and how much they bother you, but at the end of the day, the product you bought hasn't changed, just your perspective on it. I can still talk about the things in the game I find to be issues while also acknowledging that a majority of them are not the developer's fault, but rather the studio having impossible and impractical expectations. Since this is a story-driven LEGO game based on movies, it follows the same linear structure as other LEGO game adaptations, like the Harry Potter or Indiana Jones games. In this game, every movie is told through 5 levels you can replay at any time. But similarly to the Lord of the Rings LEGO game, which also has an open world, there are puzzles and side quests between levels to produce a more immersive experience. These parts cannot be replayed unless you start a new save file. The actual levels are based on the same core elements almost every LEGO game uses, those being puzzles, combat, both ranged and melee, collectibles, and platforming. Every level incorporates most, if not all of these things. Usually, a majority of the content in these games lies in the story mode, and huge parts of the marketing are focused on it. That's why, in this analysis, I will mostly stick to it as well. This game features 3 different types of levels. There are the normal levels that present you with an area you have to traverse while dealing with obstacles. These will either be enemies, some sort of puzzle, or a combination of the two. Then you have boss fights, where you recreate a duel from the films. The fighting in these is slightly different from ordinary combat that is found in normal levels. The boss has multiple health bars and will usually summon mobs when losing one of them. There are also different stages in each fight depending on how many health bars you've already taken. They can differ in environment, enemy count and type, and the boss's moveset. Last but not least are vehicle levels. Aside from some exceptions, you have to get from point A to point B or destroy a flagship while shooting down enemy fighters. Depending on what ship you pilot, your movement might vary and the environment will also be more of a factor. After completing a level, you unlock free play, allowing you to replay it using any character you want. Now you can relive your favorite moments from the Star Wars saga with your most beloved characters and discover hidden collectibles and Easter eggs that were not previously accessible. Each level also has 6 blue bricks to earn by collecting mini-kits, completing challenges, and earning enough stats to become a true Jedi. Mini-kits are items hidden in levels, and upon collecting all 5, you receive a miniature ship as a reward. Challenges will usually be about the player finding a hidden path, defeating specific enemy types, or beating a level or part of it in a certain amount of time. If the challenge is unclear by its name, you can unlock a rumor about it, making it much easier to understand. These challenges are a new addition and can be very interesting because the path I put you on can be entirely different from the more intuitive one. You also receive the amount of studs you collected throughout the level. Studs, alongside blue bricks, are used to progress in the skill tree and unlock new characters. They are also the only real penalty for dying, but we'll get back to that later when talking about difficulty. Now onto the gameplay in these levels. Starting off with combat, the Skywalker Saga updated the system significantly. In the past, you would just spam the X button to melee attack, ranged attack, block, and dodge. Now it's a bit more complicated, but still easy to understand and use. You have a combo meter that fills up with each successive attack, and the higher combo you score, the higher the reward after the combo runs out. And while not being a huge reward or even necessary most of the time, it is a welcome addition to break up the otherwise monotonous gameplay of just pressing X. If you spam the same attack too many times, your opponent will also start blocking, making it actually necessary to change your attack. Aside from that, they also brought back the lightsaber throwing from LEGO Star Wars 3 The Clone Wars, making it easier to deal with enemies from a distance. But because of this, reflecting blaster fire is no longer really necessary. You can of course still use it, but are never forced or incentivized to do so. The risk-reward aspect this used to have was that if you mistime the block you might take damage. But with how little downside lightsaber throwing has, there's never a reason not to spam it. It would have been interesting to include both these features and have them fulfill different purposes, but now they're essentially the same, with one just being superior. It is nice that the game sometimes forces you to use different attacks, but the fights are usually so short that it's not as restricting as it maybe should be. If you are facing a target and can either press X, B or Y, there needs to be a reason for you to choose any one of them. For example, heavy attacks might be a way to break strong defenses. Special attacks could be used as a gap closer, and normal attacks will be the most common choice because of lower animation time and still moderate damage. God of War Ragnarok, for instance, gives you a big damage boost if you combo your weapons, and Devil May Cry gives you a bigger payout at the end of a mission that you can reinvest into new skills. The style rating also plays into the overall rating of the level, which is an incentive to replay the level but perform even better than the last time. These are good design choices that make the player try out different attacks and combos. On the surface, the Skywalker Saga also does look quite cool, but there's nothing underneath the visually interesting moves. Most encounters will still result in the spamming of lightsaber throw and normal attack. There is no reason to perform more complex combos other than it looking neat. This makes the combo meter feel very tacked on because you can't simply take a popular feature and put it into your game. Usually there's a very good reason for every aspect of a game's gameplay to exist, and many of them are reliant on other mechanics to also exist. If you now take away these dependencies, you might as well lose what you're trying to include as well. The combo meter in this game serves no purpose, and neither do the different attacks and the combos themselves. You don't need to score a high combo on the first Vader fight because the only direct reward are stats that you can't use for new lightsaber moves, and the indirect reward of satisfying the player with a new high score doesn't really exist because the levels tend to have a performance rating akin to Devil May Cry. It looks cool in the trailer, but if you try and actually engage with the mechanics at hand, you'll quickly realize that this was either an afterthought or got lost in development hell. Ranged combat also got updated so that you no longer just press X. Now you have to aim to be more accurate, and headshots deal increased damage. This is all nothing special, but a much appreciated change for an action-focused LEGO game. The last combat mechanic to cover is health, since it works as a mistake allowance and will often dictate the difficulty. Where you used to have LEGO hearts to represent how much damage you could take before dying, you now have a health bar. Unlike the combat system, this is a change I don't see the reasoning behind. Before, it was very simple and much more transparent how many hits you could tank. Also, when increasing your health via the skill tree, the bar doesn't simply get bigger, you instead get another bar that activates when you lose the first one. I definitely prefer the LEGO hearts to the health bar because it just fits well with the simple LEGO gameplay and charm, and has no real reason to be replaced, or at least none I can think of. All this does is remove transparency from an otherwise very simple damage system. It seems a bit counterintuitive, but it's not a huge issue, so we can move on to puzzles. Puzzles make up a big part of LEGO levels, more so in other installments, but they are still heavily present in Star Wars. There are several fundamentally different puzzles throughout the story mode, but many of them follow a vague formula. Go to the place we show you in a camera pan, but to get there you need the special ability of one of your characters. Now that the first character is there, make sure to get the other one as well so they can use a terminal or something along those lines. In the older games, terminals were mostly used to activate part of a puzzle, progress in a level, or reach a minikit room that is only accessible in free play. You would just press B and move on with a puzzle or level. This by itself is not engaging gameplay, but when combined with other elements, terminals can be used in interesting ways. In the Skywalker Saga, the terminal system has been updated and expanded upon. There are now more terminals, and most of them have a unique component to them. Despite being an upgrade from the older system, there is still room to criticize these new mechanics. Most of them are very monotonous and easy to do, and that's leaving out the fact that you can buy an upgrade in the skill tree that makes it possible to skip these puzzles. While the protocol draw terminals can be used to further player choice, the other ones are essentially the same as the old ones, just instead of no puzzle, they are what you might consider the bare minimum of a puzzle. The old games were at least honest about that and didn't pretend to be more than just a button press. They often just served as a barrier to lock the player in a room, forcing them to engage with the puzzle at hand. The character to access their terminal would be unlocked by the end of the puzzle. I have no problem with improving the terminal system, but these changes are just superficial. As soon as a challenge is spotted in this game, there's immediately a way to bypass it. It's not even that these are hard puzzles outside of the critical path a younger audience might struggle with. These are literally the easiest puzzles in the entire game. There are parts of the story where you walk for a couple of minutes and the only meaningful interaction you have is a terminal at the end. This is very shallow world design just to drag out the playtime and make the game seem bigger than it actually is. The open world sections in LEGO Lord of the Rings were at least partially used to introduce new features, but here most are just busy work with basically no depth. And the worst part is that the terminals aren't even that engaging to begin with. If the open world sections were still as lazy as they are now, but at the end was something a bit more demanding, I would still call them lazy, but at least the puzzle at the end wouldn't be as brain dead. I see the option to just outright remove parts of the game as an insecurity in their own design. You can't skip the normal puzzles, so there's clearly meant to be some unavoidable challenge. It's also not framed like an accessibility feature since it has to be purchased in the skill tree. I would have less of an issue with this if the framing was different. Why not do it like the Mumble mode, which is free from the start? Call it Legacy Terminals or something. But surely this is the only instance of the game subverting its challenges and everything else is very well put together. Aside from the difficulty of the puzzles, which is a topic for later, the amount is also very low. In another playthrough I did, I set rules for myself that are as follows. Don't leave the main path in the levels and in the open world, don't skip cutscenes, and fight all enemies in the levels. I bought upgrades as soon as they were available and focused on story mode. The idea was to recreate a first playthrough of the story mode, because usually you would play the levels once and then 100% them with a bigger roster. Also, exploring the open world without finishing story mode doesn't make much sense since you oftentimes have to either use an ability you haven't unlocked yet, or visit a planet you can't travel to. I then edited the footage and cut out parts where I was AFK and categorized the rest in either level gameplay, cutscene, open world gameplay between levels, or useless walking sections. Level gameplay is basically the entirety of a level after the opening cutscene and prior to the closing one. Open world gameplay and useless walking are only different in the way that gameplay sections have at least one interaction with the game that is more than walking. These go from pressing one button on a terminal to solving more complex puzzles and platforming. I wanted to know how much time in the game was being spent actually playing the game. This does not take into account how good the gameplay is, just how much of it is present. So if we say that levels and open world are the two categories to count for gameplay, we are at roughly 61%, or 6 hours and 12 minutes of the overall 10 hours and 8 minutes of playtime. And this includes sections like these. This is already a staggeringly low amount of gameplay just looking at the numbers without the context. The OT had the best ratio of 67% gameplay with the longest average levels. The sequels were more cutscene heavy than the other two trilogies, but they also had the most open world gameplay. The film with the most cutscenes is The Rise of Skywalker, which kind of makes sense given how densely packed that film is. The walking sections are most frequent in the prequels, and Attack of the Clones has as much walking as the OT in its entirety. The other numbers I got from this playthrough are going to be relevant again later, but for now the focus is on puzzles. To figure out what's going on with them, I went through the 10 hours of footage again and took notes for the different interactions. I mainly want to look at the standard LEGO puzzles, terminals, and quick-time events for now, because they are broadly what you would call a puzzle. In my playthrough I had 292 puzzle interactions. 33 of them were actual puzzles where you could fail or make mistakes. These can still be poorly designed, but they have the highest player engagement, and in a puzzle the player should have very high agency. The game wants you to solve a problem, so the problem should not be able to solve itself. The next category for me were the 60 puzzles you almost couldn't fail, like putting a battery into a slot for a battery. These do technically still need a player to be resolved, but you don't have to put any thought into it. The game tells you to do an action, and so you do it. Then we also have 40 terminals. I already talked about them in detail, so here's the TLDR. They are interesting in the beginning, but get very monotonous once you did each of them a couple of times. They are also all skippable, so there isn't much of a point to engage with them. And if you do, there is still barely any thought required. And the last type of interaction are the 159 quicktime events. Out of these 159 QTEs, 89 are auto wins if you fail, and a couple more have an infinite timer. So more than half of them are unlosable and therefore offer nothing. The other half also includes the Luke Kylo fight, which consists entirely of QTEs. They are already controversial because of how they are often implemented. They tend to come across like an insecurity to retain the player's attention in sections that are not gameplay heavy. There are scenarios where a QTE might be the best way to translate something to the player. A stressful situation or a close encounter where overpowering is the only option come to mind. But when they are spammed with seemingly no restraint or reason, they are just so dull. If they had a lot less and made them meaningful, the abundance of QTEs would be so much more bearable.
I'm going to die!
This is all disregarding that most of them are unlosable to make them even more uninteresting. So out of the 292 puzzle interactions, only 33 are worthwhile challenges, which is about 11% of the game and not even close to one per level. Keep in mind that this does not include the open world. I think this is proof enough that the game's focus was definitely not its puzzles. I recently replayed other LEGO games and noticed that they focused much more on puzzles than LEGO Star Wars did. This could be because the Star Wars games are generally older and the level design wasn't as well refined as in many of the newer games. Or because they leaned more on the action with their Star Wars games. Either way, just because it's a LEGO game, it doesn't have to be focused on being a puzzle game. Just like not every LEGO game has to be based on a movie or franchise. Maybe, instead of puzzles, the game's focus was similar to Star Wars Battlefront 2's campaign, where you would replay battles seen in the movie and be carried away by the scenery while taking over a spaceship or the Jedi Temple. That game is also pretty simple with its combat and mostly appealing because of the interesting premise of replaying Order 66 as a clone trooper. Or maybe this game's focus is on telling a story and being funny like the South Park games. The main selling point for these two games is their atmosphere, and they were definitely aware of that. It doesn't really matter what the focus of a game is as long as it isn't conflicting with the rest of the gameplay. And with how disappointing puzzles are in this game, let's see if the atmosphere is any better. Among my favorite things from LEGO Star Wars The Clone Wars is the prologue mission on Geonosis. There was just so much going on and the arena was full of enemies. Compare that to this game where barely anything is happening. Almost none of the battles you play through convey the spectacle from the movies well. In the Grievous fight, there are droids fighting clones in the background, but even if they decide to spawn properly, they just ignore you and sort of do their own thing. They don't even count as real enemies since they don't have a health bar and just fall over if you hit them once. Compare this to the Jedi Temple Assault in Battlefront 2, where no matter the room you're in, there's always a fight going on until all of your troops have died. The most egregious example of background fights might be in Episode 8 when you fight Captain Phasma. You are technically presented with enemies to fill up the room like in the movie, but from the 6 stormtroopers, only 3 don't instantly run off, with one of them using a turret only to not fire a single shot and uses blaster instead. And another one standing in a corner just waiting for me to shoot him, not even firing back. Once you switch to the other side, it's more of the same, with one of the troopers anxiously dropping his baton only to come and fistfight you. Another one focusing on Finn or noticing Rose standing out in the open. And the third, not being sure if shooting Rose and Finn is worth the paperwork he would have to fill out. But while thinking about it, he keeps aiming just to make sure they don't escape. Sadly, he shortly after dies via an explosive barrel he was using for cover. In the AT-ST section, the Stormtrooper's AI starts getting even weirder. Some of them at least try to shoot you, but most of them just walk around as if nothing is going on. Only when you start firing at them do they start fleeing. And since they are part of a hive mind, all of them share the same 2 states the game can't seem to decide between. 1 second, they all run in fear, but a second later, they have forgotten all about it, only to once again start aimlessly running for their lives. The big problem is that this is by far not the only example. You can make a direct comparison between Star Wars Battlefront 2, the complete Saga, and this game in how they portrayed the droid attack on the Wookiees. In the first 2 games it feels like an actual invasion, while in this game you take out a couple of droids and it's already over. I really don't get why they downgraded the spectacle so much. This just looks really boring despite the beautiful graphics. Another aspect to the atmosphere of LEGO games is their charm and comedy. The original LEGO Star Wars games had many mediocre or bad levels, but the charm was something they excelled at. Much of that charm is still present in this game, like unique animations and funny Easter eggs to find in freeplay. There were many things I smiled all laughter at when I first saw them, like Anakin's alarm clock or a Jabba the Hutt theme song, which reminded me of the fever dream that was the Book of Boba Fett.
I grew up surrounded by water.
So in terms of the patented LEGO charm, this game can definitely still deliver. But its comedy is a complicated topic, and I think to best explain why, I have to talk about it later in combination with the open world and how the story is integrated in it. An important aspect of the game I already hinted at earlier is its difficulty. And this game is, let's just say, interesting for now in regards to its challenges. Considering it is designed to be played by children, it has to clearly communicate with the player even more so than other games. It needs to be understood what the current challenges and their individual fail states are. A core challenge of LEGO games are puzzles. We went over their variety before, but now it's time to look at how hard they are to beat. There are many puzzles that consist of moving around power sources. Most are very plain and not layered. In Better Call Maul, you don't put them in the panel directly, which is at least something. Boarding Party makes you flip 2 switches. This Is Some Rescue has you stand on a button to pull a lever. and No Smoke Without Fire is a slight variation of the same thing. Exploring the Force Cave with Rey is a very creative way to translate what's happening in the story. Working with the mirror imagery was fun while it lasted before returning to the usual puzzles. The examples listed here are some of the more complex ones in the story. This game's standards for what constitutes as multi-layered is so incredibly low that I have to point to this as one of the most complex things this game ever tries. And the one or two puzzles that are more ambitious are in between levels, so you can't even replay them within the same save file. With the small scope of the puzzles, the punishment for failing is equally low. This isn't even a bad thing, because the more casual tone of the game wouldn't fit well with a system like Jump King, where you have to painstakingly repeat the last couple of jumps which took you an hour to get right the first time. So while the puzzle difficulty isn't bad in concept, its execution is wildly too unambitious. It's not like LEGO games need to be the pinnacle of puzzle games, but it would be preferable if the simple mechanics were pushed beyond the surface level. Moving on to enemies, a majority of the game's combat is against mobs like stormtroopers. They are very simple to deal with and don't do much damage. Even if they come in huge numbers, they usually aren't much of a problem since you can either hide behind cover to wait for an opportunity to attack, dodge their fire, or just tank through it. This in combination with a low to non-existent punishment for dying makes the enemy encounters fairly easy. This is not necessarily a problem, but in parts of the game where all you have is the combat, it gets very repetitive very quickly. Some levels feature a more unique way of dealing with enemies, which is a nice breath of fresh air. And while those aren't very complex either, I do appreciate the effort that went into crafting a unique encounter and the level around it. Before moving on to vehicle levels, I want to talk about dying in LEGO games. When you die in a LEGO game, you drop studs in a small area around you and respawn at the position you died at. Therefore, you can almost always pick a majority of the studs back up. And even if you don't, it's not like you need them for anything. This means that losing a couple of studs is not a big punishment, unless you want to fill the True Jedi bar on your first playthrough or without stud multipliers in free play. I understand that a kids game will not be as punishing as Jump King, but if the only punishment there is to dying is losing a small amount of in-game currency you already have too much of anyway, the punishment only serves an aesthetic purpose. Falling off the track in Mario Kart is on the surface very similar to this. You also respawn where you fell down and don't receive further punishment like damage to your cart or something. But it does set you behind other players, which is the core challenge of Mario Kart. You want to come in first on the shortest time possible if you play time trial, but falling down will be in direct conflict with that goal and therefore it is a meaningful punishment. Dying in a LEGO game essentially means nothing because the goal state is not time sensitive like in Mario Kart. This is the same for every LEGO game, and I don't think they will ever move away from it. But I would prefer if there were alternatives that can offer a challenge, like a time trial mode, or having a True Jedi bar that is only for story mode where stud multipliers are disabled. And because there's only a set number of studs in every level, that actually has meaning on their completion. An example of a different punishment for failure is the pod race in episode 1. You have to come in first to complete the level, and the changing environment and quick time events try to hinder you from doing so. It is also very fast paced, so mistakes can slow you down very easily. In case of the pod race, the quick time events work well because if you fail you will slow down and be therefore further away from finishing in first place. But there are other instances, for example the one in Rise of Skywalker where Poe Lightspeed skips. The game shows you the prompt for a quick time event, but if you fail the event or don't engage with it, the game moves on as if you succeeded. This leaves us with the boss fights, and they have the same issues. When the boss is close to losing one of their health bars, you are prompted to spam a button to progress with the fight. The game gives you more than enough time, but if you still manage to fail, well, then it moves on as if you didn't. So LEGO Star Wars The Skywalker Saga is in parts playable without actually playing it. My inputs don't matter for the game's progression, which kinda defeats the point of video games as an interactive medium. Apart from the puzzles and combat, the older games sometimes had platforming sections, and the Skywalker Saga also changed this aspect, but I can't really say it's for the better. Instead of jumping from platform to platform using your own experience with the movement controls to estimate how far you need to jump, the game regresses. In a majority of cases, when you're faced with a platform to jump across, all you have to do now is press the A button and the game does the rest for you. At what point do you have to consider as a player that the game doesn't trust you with actually playing the game? Where other games hold your hand to guide you in the beginning, this game crams its fist up your rear end and makes it virtually impossible to fail throughout. A majority of the quicktime events are just useless to engage with, and the few things that could have been called challenging in the older games are mostly reduced to a bare minimum or just removed. In Pirates of the Caribbean, the platforming is similar to this, but a bit more subtle with the help you receive if you're slightly off with your jump. But I guess even that wasn't simple enough. I'd like to go on a slight tangent now and look at this game's version of Attack of the Clones, because many, if not all, issues this game has are present in these 5 levels. Attack of the Clones begins with the assassination attempt on Padme, after which you walk to Palpatine's office to play the next cutscene. Once that is done, you walk as Anakin, Obi-Wan and Padme to get to her apartment from where the first mission will be started. When you escort Padme, you cannot sprint and are not able to move faster than her. During this, you hear the dialogue from the film re-recorded with the Clone Wars voice actors. After another cutscene, the first mission of the movie starts. Without exploring anything and just following directions, this takes about 5 to 6 minutes, with time being split between walking and watching cutscenes. At first glance, this is not a problem because they have to tell you the story somehow. But when walking behind Padme, there are many gaps when no one is speaking, and some lines are also added that are not in the movie.
Is it much farther, Master?
Is mine and Padme's company boring you already, my Padawan?
So telling the story doesn't have to mean slowly walking behind Padme instead of just skipping to the next scene like in the older games. But more on this later. The first mission features the Zam Wesell chase where she tries to escape Obi-Wan and Anakin. It's pretty simple in its construction. She has a health bar and you shoot her. This might work as a base concept to design a level around, but in this case, that's all of it. There are almost no unique elements added to this level, aside from her spontaneous invulnerability in some sections. Sometimes you have to dodge or shoot the gates and move out of her blue laser dust. If you don't, your ship takes damage and your blasters stop working for a short moment. But in terms of challenge, they might as well not exist because the setbacks are entirely inconsequential. It's impossible for her to get away because she just waits for you to respawn. Imagine playing a racing game and whenever you bump into something or crash, all other drivers are frozen in place while you recover. Really makes it hard to get immersed. Playing this level without auto-aim is also about as engaging as watching paint dry. Her constant dodging and flying through walls would be a lot more tolerable if the level had more to offer. Especially when catching up to her isn't reliant on the player's skill because there are no obstacles in your way. In the pod race, if you make a mistake and get slowed down, you have to continuously fly well to catch back up. But here it's just nothing until you get back in range and she dodges again. This in combination with her small and inconsistent hitbox makes for a very tedious experience. It doesn't make use of its setting at all. What if there were other people on the road you had to account for and the speed was a bit higher? Now let's say you had to jump down as Anakin and simultaneously pilot the ship as Obi-Wan to catch him after his jump. LEGO games are absolutely capable of doing this, but there was no attempt made to make this level stand out. Following the events of the movie, Obi-Wan is now getting information about the Kamino Saber Dart from Dexter Jettster. But first is an interaction with the open world instead of just going to the next mission. This was already done in the LEGO Lord of the Rings game, and the mandatory side quests can help direct the player to explore the new place they just arrived in. Here you have to serve tables at Dexter's Diner. It doesn't really add anything, it just feels very out of place. As a mission in the open world outside of story mode I might understand it, but making this mandatory makes no sense to me. Compare this to the Rey puzzle in TLJ. Not only is it a unique experience, it also takes something that actually happens in the movie and features gameplay to reflect something that would otherwise just be a cutscene. That's why table serving at Dexter's Diner seems like pointless filler. After that, you walk to the Jedi Temple, watch a cutscene, fly to Kamino, RP walk to Jango's chambers, watch a cutscene, and then fight Jango Fett. This is about 15 minutes of walking and watching cutscenes until the first interaction with the game that requires sentience from the player. The fight against Jango is also very short and barely utilizes the existence of Slave 1. It could easily be longer and feature more things that make the scene unique in the film. There is plenty of spectacle to include from that fight, but barely any of it made it into the game. From this we move straight into the second mission where you fight Jango in space. While being nothing noteworthy, it at least feels more unique than the first level. The environment can be somewhat challenging and it has a more engaging opponent until the point where he inevitably gets stuck. You then cut to Anakin and Padme on Naboo, fly to Tatooine, speak to Watto, fly to the desert, watch a cutscene, walk around a corner, watch a cutscene, fly to Geonosis, walk through the desert, watch a cutscene, and then start the next level. This all takes about another 10 minutes, which is not a lot in terms of storytelling, but in terms of playing a video game it drags on for a long time because you don't interact with the game except holding down your left joystick. This starts the conveyor belt mission, and the first thing that stood out was the frame rate. I know that it's fixed by now, but at the time of release and even half a year later, the level ran worse than Bloodborne. That aside, I quite like how they changed this level from the complete Saga. You have to complete puzzles as R2 and 3PO and then cut back to Anakin and Padme to progress in the level. The opening puzzle is also interesting because it uses old mechanics in a new way. Sadly, this is the only time you have to use the Force like this. At least it was better to have it be used once than not at all. The challenges in this level also seem very well integrated. You have to think outside of the box to achieve them, which is not something you can say for most of the other levels. I would say that this level, in terms of its design, is one of the better ones the game has to offer, especially in the prequels. It suffers from the same problems every level in this game is plagued by, but the variety of puzzles and challenges is better than in most other levels. Once the level is completed, you jump back to Coruscant as Mace Windu and fly back to Geonosis. Why couldn't he just be on the planet already? I know it doesn't take that long, but the time being spent doing nothing in this game really adds up. The next level is the battle in the Geonosian arena. It's separated into two parts. The first one being the escape of Anakin, Obi-Wan and Padme, and the second one a boss fight between Jango Fett and Mace Windu. In the first part, you have to defeat the 3 animals meant to kill you. And that's it. The fights with them aren't too special but serviceable. They could have easily drawn inspiration from LEGO Star Wars 3 again, which essentially had the same ideas but executed them more thoroughly. In order to break free from the chains, you had to swap between characters, and the same went for the fights. The second part of the level also could have taken some inspiration from its predecessors. In this game, there's barely anything going on in terms of scenery, and the fight against Django is as bland as most of the other fights.
Die, Jedi dogs! What did I say?
In LEGO Star Wars 3, you had so many battle droids walking around and shooting at you. And fighting Django meant you had to throw your lightsaber to bring him down and then hit him. It's nothing incredible, but the devs of that game clearly had the time to make that level a unique experience that could convey the scale of a war to some extent. In the complete saga, you also play through the same events, but the levels have such different elements to them that having barely anything in this game is so disappointing. After beating Django, the gunships land and it's already over because the escorting section has also been cut. This level is a pretty big letdown, especially in comparison to older games. Which brings us to the last mission of the movie, and after the obligatory open world interaction, you start the fight against Dooku. I have mixed feelings about this level, because while there's a lot to explore in it, it's all unnecessary unless you want to complete the challenges. After the first puzzle, there's a big portion where you RP walk while fighting Geonosians. There isn't even much dialogue playing here, so I think this might just be a bug. The fight against Dooku is alright. It makes use of some mechanics, but nothing out of the ordinary. The pipes you have to get out of the way are sort of new, but you can only move them in one direction and not even make a mistake if you tried. There is no challenge in pressing B and moving your joystick in a singular direction. The fight mostly plays like any other fight, but they took some inspiration from the movie by adding a short sequence where it's dark. That is also over very quickly, but I'll take what I can get. After beating him and watching a cutscene, the movie is over. It clocks in at about 65 minutes, from which 28 are spent playing the 5 levels, 16 on watching cutscenes, another 16 on walking without any meaningful gameplay, and 5 minutes on walking that either resulted in a fight or included a puzzle. And you just saw how monotonous and uninspired most of the level gameplay is. This is not a strong showing for a LEGO game. Not only are the levels way too short, but also reduced to the lowest possible difficulty. The time spent between each level is almost exclusively walking across a planet and flying through space with very little gameplay. And many of these parts are longer than a lot of the levels. This wouldn't be a big issue if the levels were at least well thought out and showed some variety. 3 of the 5 levels heavily fail at capturing the gameplay that makes LEGO games great, while 1 level is mostly bad with slightly interesting ideas, and 1 is actually pretty good in the context of this game. This is obviously just one of the 9 movies, and based on that, I can't make a definitive claim about every level, but in terms of its overall structure, the game is very similar throughout. I will continue pointing out many of the already presented issues as we move forward. Hopefully that way, I can convince some people that the things I mentioned for this film aren't just nitpicky minor details about one level, but rather deep-rooted fundamental issues with this game. But first, I want to mention some of the things I think work in this game's favor. It looks gorgeous, but knowing about the crunch the engine caused, it's hard to appreciate it fully. I still prefer the old perspective over this one, but especially in terms of graphics, this game is quite remarkable. In the opening level of A New Hope, you can choose between several paths, making exploring the level on both the first and second playthrough much more interesting. Looking around also means finding Easter eggs like a copy of the original LEGO Star Wars game, or stormtroopers in whirlpools. If you just follow the main path of the level, it's still a bit short, but as an opening it's quite good. It also introduces a mechanic that lets you choose what to build from a pile of bricks. In this case, the choice was between a fire extinguisher and a laser turret. This slightly changes how the level plays out and offers alternatives to explore. Sadly, it rarely comes up, and if it does, it has almost no effect on the gameplay. Like in Empire, where you can either build a magnet or turret to take down a probe droid. This doesn't really offer a meaningful alternative, but when it's used right, just like the protocol droid terminals, it's really fun to explore the different ways a level can be played. Another example that comes to mind are the chests you can open to find firearms in. When breaking out Leia in episode 4, you had several different weapons to choose from, which is new for LEGO Star Wars games. This is mostly a superficial edition and has barely any mechanical weight to it, but I still enjoyed it on that superficial level. This almost never comes up again, and after trying out some of the weapons, there was really no need to not use the one your character has already equipped. I also like the new force features where you can panic, influence, or distract someone. Especially force influencing was pretty cool, and the way it's introduced in A New Hope is very natural by way of the narrative. I wish this was something you had to do more often and in a more creative way than just pressing a button or pulling a lever with the person you controlled. But even the few times it came up, it was pretty enjoyable. You might have noticed that there's always a caveat with each of the mentioned features. The word I would use to describe them is underutilized, and maybe underexplored. It seems like separate teams worked on these episodes, so some features barely show up outside of the level they're introduced in. It's all very self-contained, which is a shame because some of the less implemented features are the ones I would praise the most. Another good example for this are the classes. The game features 9 different classes that each have a unique ability. In the older games, this was very limited. Just like the terminals, the classes were very simplistic and didn't have much depth to them, and the Skywalker Saga adds to these things while also keeping most of the old stuff. So that's good, right? Well, kind of. Let's look at the Scavenger, because it's one of the completely new additions. The Scavenger traits are introduced in either the 4th mission of Episode 6 or the 1st mission of Episode 7. In the sequels, there are several instances of the Scavenger traits being required to solve puzzles. In Return of the Jedi, there's only one level where it comes up a couple of times and that's it for the OT, and it's not present at all in the prequels. That's why I get the impression that the teams behind the trilogies didn't really get to work together to implement the features they had come up with. The same goes for the rest of the classes, as most things you can upgrade don't meaningfully affect the gameplay. The core upgrades are pretty useful, but most others are just niche abilities that really aren't all that integral. Especially with some of them relying on accessibility settings many people will have disabled. I don't want to spend too much time on the skill tree because of its low impact on the gameplay, but I would have liked the upgrades for the Scavenger or Jedi class to consist of new abilities. It could have tied the skill tree much closer to the story mode and made it less superfluous. But with the way it is now, engaging with the skill tree outside of the core upgrades is only useful if you want to skip parts of the gameplay, or experiment with some of the interesting but unnecessary skills. Like all the other LEGO games, this one also has extras. Many of them are fun to use, but there are 2 I would like to focus on. They are Mumble Mode and Universal Translator. If you try to speak to aliens in the open world, you will oftentimes not understand them because they speak another language. The idea is for sure interesting, but doesn't really add anything to the gameplay, because changing characters is not an issue at any point in the open world. If the game had something like a bounty hunter mode where you need to search for someone in the open world using tracking forbs, this could be an obstacle to overcome. This feels very much like an undercooked idea that didn't get the required time or effort to properly work. TT Games apparently thought so too, which is why the Universal Translator exists. If enabled, it will completely remove that aspect of the game. And this is the same for the Mumble mode. It is unlocked for free and turns all the dialogue into mumbling like in the older LEGO games. The problem unfortunately is that while it removes the dialogue, which is a whole nother topic of its own, the gameplay doesn't change. So if you didn't like listening to the dialogue and RP walking for a large portion of the game, that won't change by enabling Mumble mode. For the resulting issues of the dialogue to disappear, there would have to be bigger changes than making everyone mumble. It's just a band-aid that can't get rid of an underlying problem. With the skippable terminals, the Universal Translator, and the Mumble mode, the game introduces several mechanics but also offers a way to just never interact with them again. I don't even think the alternatives necessarily work, as I already explained. Other than that, I enjoy playing around with the extras for a while. Until now, we mostly talked about the mechanics of normal levels, so I would like to dedicate some time to the boss fights. Many are just that, a boss fight. In the past, they would usually be at the end of a level filled with puzzles, or feature puzzles themselves. This isn't because the fights can't inherently stand on their own, but rather because the simple attack patterns can quickly get repetitive, so the necessary variety is provided by other elements instead of the fight itself, which in the Skywalker Saga usually results in the boss sending out mobs and hiding behind a puzzle in between phases. The difficulty of these puzzles is something I already went over, so I won't go into further detail again. Now, disregarding the puzzles, let's focus on the fight itself. There is a sizable amount of boss fights that don't even feature any puzzles. There's nothing inherently bad about this. Plenty of games with boss fights will focus purely on the fight itself, but in those games the fighting is usually good and the bosses are unique in both their presentation and attacks. And while LEGO games might not be able to feature movesets for their bosses as difficult or complex as other games because they are meant to be played by children, they could take some inspiration from the visual spectacle and variety other games offer. We already went over the scenery in general, but boss fights fail equally in this regard and are almost exclusively different on a superficial level. If you played one, you basically play them all because the vast majority of them offer the exact same experience. Not only is that true when you compare them, but also when looking at the individual stages of one fight. There's really no difference which one of the Knights of Ren you're fighting, or how many arms General Grievous has left. If the fights want to stand on their own, they have to be more versatile than this. The boss's movesets mostly consist of normal lightsaber attacks with an AoE ability or ranged attack thrown in every once in a while. They don't react to the way you attack them and will never do anything more complex than just hitting you straight up with a lightsaber, with the exception of their one obligatory charge attack. Their attacks feel less like a pattern you could learn and much more like a random string of moves interrupted by very long pauses. And once you make them lose a health bar, they enter a state where they either run towards you or the next waypoint. They stop taking damage and will sometimes even get stuck or confused by you running around in circles. The Star Wars movies feature such a wide variety of settings and spectacle for the biggest moments in the saga, but barely any of them are represented in this game. Looking at the complete saga in the Clone Wars, the fights would take place on a falling ship or challenge you with the environment of Mustafar, where you couldn't just press A to beat the platforming. Funnily enough, there's one boss fight at the end of a level I actually enjoyed, and the level up until that point wasn't too special either. I don't know if it's because I had lowered my expectations after being disappointed so many times, but the boss fight against Evil BB-8 was pretty enjoyable and unique. And while I wouldn't call that fight good by any stretch of the imagination, there was at least something that made it stand out. Why is a random fight against Evil BB-8 one of the most distinct boss fight experiences you can have in this game alongside Captain Phasma? Evil BB-8 and fucking Chrome Dome are more engaging fights than the Battle of the Heroes. In The Rise of Skywalker, Rey gives Kylo a lightsaber through the Force, but this is not something the game makes use of for its gameplay. The whole dyad in the Force thing really isn't all that present in this game. Imagine if you had to juggle items between Kylo and Rey or fight each other through Force Skype. The problem here is that while lightsaber combat works fine, you still want the fights to be different from each other in a way that is not just superficial. This would make them so much more memorable. I can't see anyone going back to replay a specific fight in this game. There's virtually no difference mechanically between these two levels, and this has nothing to do with wanting to maintain a low difficulty. You can do that without being repetitive. There are obvious attempts at creating unique fights in the game. The example that makes this clear to me is the fight against Kylo Ren as Luke in TLJ. The idea with that fight is that you don't actually beat Kylo, but rather dodge his attacks to buy time for the others. This works well for both narrative and gameplay because what you're doing is informed by your character, and it's significantly different from other boss fights. It also avoids a huge problem other boss fights have. I'm again talking about the quicktime events that will usually be between phase transitions. I already went over these, but their frequent presence in the boss fights makes me want to mention them again. Rarely do they require player input to progress despite the way they're presented. All they are is a visual distraction from the lack of engaging gameplay and challenge. Now if your defense is that this is a game for kids and therefore allowed to be easy, you missed my point. I'm not saying that these parts are too easy, but rather that they offer no challenge. Not just to me or you, but to literally everyone just by the definition of what a challenge is. A challenge is something you have to overcome. Now how much of an obstacle that is depends on the person engaging with it. But if there is no way to fail, everyone can overcome it without putting in the effort and it ceases to be a challenge. Watching a movie or cutscene is not a challenge. Engaging with and understanding it can be, but putting on a movie, leaving, and coming back 2 hours later is not. Feel free to spam your unplugged controller on your next Star Wars watch through and it will have the same meaning as engaging with the quicktime events in this game. Another issue that is particularly jarring in boss fights is the camera. The camera control throughout the game is mostly fine, but in some cases, and especially boss fights, the camera gets incredibly close, making it almost seem like first person. And since the game wasn't designed with that in mind, the screen starts to look chaotic. Sometimes this doesn't matter too much, but in boss fights where it's very important to see a specific enemy all the time, it is critical that the camera works as intended. Something I only came across recently is that when switching to a ranged character in free play and most melee characters, the autofocus stops working. This would be much easier to deal with if we had a focus button like a majority of action games. It seems like the game hard-coded autofocus to lightsaber users, meaning everyone else has to control the camera manually. The main problem with this is that you now only have certain opportunities to explore a level freely if you want to play this set of characters, which is quite annoying when a large part of free play is collecting hidden items. While we are on the topic of free play, there was something else that annoyed me. I wanted to look at the Luke vs Vader fight again to get footage from it and thought I'd play as my favorite Anzellan. But here's the problem. You are simply not allowed to play as anyone else but Luke in this level. With how short the levels are, replayability is already damaged enough. So why limit the player's choice in the one game mode where it's all about that? Half the fun of free play is your ability to fight Darth Vader in a fist fight or defeat Grievous as Grievous in a clusterfuck of lightsabers. These limitations are present in so many levels, which is just another jab at the enjoyment you can derive from this game. By restricting the ability to change characters or ships in free play, you are stripped of literally the only purpose a free play level has. I assume this was done for the sake of continuity in cutscenes, since the game is designed to be as cinematic as possible. But you can still have that without damaging the gameplay. And if that were the reason, it is still inconsistently enforced, since there are levels where you can change characters despite there being cutscenes. These are the main issues that exist just in the boss fights, or the ones most present in them. Of course, they still suffer from everything the other levels do as well. This brings us to the last type of levels being the vehicle levels. They make up 14 out of the 45 missions in total and are therefore roughly a third of the story mode's content. Many of them differ heavily in terms of what ship you pilot or what obstacles you face. The pod race, for example, looks completely different to the opening of The Last Jedi. One is also about going through the level as fast as possible, while the other one is about shooting down TIE fighters and damaging a ship enough to help your allies escape. Sometimes you will also have an environment that makes achieving these goals harder, like an asteroid field. So we have different environments, ships, and challenges, which is a good start, but when we get into the levels themselves, most of them sadly fall apart. Starting with the first flying level in the game, a bigger fish lets you escape from big fish in a pretty uneventful chase scene. The level itself isn't all that exciting and definitely one of the weaker ones in this game. After performing the first dodge, the right joystick ceased to function for me. But I was in luck, because on this mission it is pretty much superfluous anyway, since you can still sort of aim by just flying around with the normal movement controls. On top of that, the direction of the dodge you need to perform several times is also irrelevant. Even if you were to die because you failed too many times, you respawn where you died and continue as if nothing happened. Another perfect example of this is the opening level of episode 9. You are stripped of most of the usual controls and can only move your left joystick and shoot. This level is just a long cutscene where you have to hold down one button and on occasion slightly move left or right. It could have been more engaging if there was a time limit which would mirror the scene in the movie, or switch it up a bit and make it so you have to protect the mole while he uploads the message. This wouldn't magically make the level good, but in its current state it's basically the same as the Zem Wessel or speeder bike chase. The scene also has a lot of visual spectacle with the lightspeed skipping, but the quicktime events that reflect it are just a participation trophy again. Given how in the narrative this maneuver Poe is doing is very risky and borderline impossible, there could have been something reflecting that in the gameplay. There is one level I didn't go into detail on yet, and I believe it to be the worst flying level in the entire game, with others shortly after it. In this level you have to chase speeder bikes like in the movie, but here it doesn't quite feel that way because for a majority of the chase you are ahead of the bike troopers and they seem to have trouble catching up. The game also takes away any meaningful controls again. All you can do is move left or right and shoot. You can't accelerate or slow down and you can't aim. This, just like the Zem Wessel chase, is as close to unplayable as you can get when not playing with auto-aim. Not having core movement controls also takes away from the fight. Taking inspiration from the movie, wouldn't it be cool to purposely slow down to surprise the enemy from behind? Well, too bad, because you can't. The tread speeder chase in episode 9 is at least slightly better because it offers 2 different types of enemies and 2 ways to deal with them. These levels are very frustrating to play because apart from pressing mostly just one button, there's nothing for you to do. While I enjoyed a few of the flying levels in this game, they also feature some of the most dreadful gaming experiences I've ever encountered, due to their uninspired and poor design. There is also one other level I have to bring up here, and while it's not a flying level, I think thematically it fits quite well. In the level Hibernation Station, there's a part where Chewie has to fix the Falcon and you stop stormtroopers from interfering. They have only one entrance and spawn infinitely until a certain point of progression is reached. This results in you just holding down one button until Chewie is done. An easy fix for this would have been to make you swap back and forth between Chewie and C-3PO, and Lando and Leia. That way, you would always have 2 playable characters for co-op and make the level much more interesting. The AI partners aren't that great at dealing with many enemies at once, so while they would be able to kill some of them, you would have to come in every once in a while and assist them. And if the spawns were spread out a bit, it would be even better. Meanwhile, you would have to run on top or inside the Falcon to repair it. That level would be very unique and not just consist of pressing one button for a big part of it. Unfortunately, this is how many levels can be described, but the flying levels are even worse because your movement is so restricted in most of them. Despite my praise of some of the new additions in this game, there are a lot of features dropped from the originals for what seems to be no reason. Playing as Jango Fett allows you to fly either infinitely or at least a couple of seconds depending on what game you play. In this game the jetpacks work a bit differently, because after activating them you can no longer change the direction and only fly a very short distance. This makes it pretty clunky and underwhelming in comparison to every other version. Something the first 2 games also had was a true Jedi buff for both story and freeplay mode, giving the player an incentive to not just rush through every level in story mode and come back to it later with more characters. It was removed for the complete Saga, which is a shame because I think it really adds to the gameplay if the levels are well designed. This can also result in a very tedious experience if there are hundreds of interactable objects with only a couple of stats behind them, so I understand why it would have been removed. But if a level is well enough designed, going for that 100% golden bar of pure dopamine would be a great satisfaction, instead of being able to just slap on your favorite stat multiplier. Another dropped feature are the challenge and bounty hunter modes. These were time trials in which you had to find a person or collect blue canisters in a level in record time. They could be pretty entertaining at times because by giving you a high score you could measure your achieved time with your friends online. My favorite missions in LEGO The Clone Wars back when I first played it were the ones where you would have to retake a battlefield piece by piece. You could call in reinforcements and the more command posts were under your control, the more units were available. It combined a very bare-bones RTS system with the LEGO mechanics and I absolutely loved it. It could have been more fleshed out, but for what it was really interesting. Sadly, this got completely dropped. Just imagine the possibility of combining this with the commander subclass in the skill tree, where you could upgrade your reinforcements and unlock new troops and vehicles. We already examined some added features I think are good for the game and some others that are either bad or superfluous. But removing these things is just a bit sad because many of them offer some replayability for the game. Something I wanted to mention that I really liked was that when playing as Finn in the fight against Kylo Ren, you were not able to use the lightsaber throw because Finn was not a Jedi or really a Force user and could therefore not use these moves. I was genuinely surprised at how they used the continuity of the films to make the combat different from other fights. But then the game told me that I should throw my lightsaber anyway, and I found people reporting this as a bug. But I think they just try to make Finn fighting with a lightsaber feel different from other Jedi. But it stops at that, and his attacks don't feel heavier like they do in the film. It's still nice though to see thought being put into his character. Another big feature for LEGO games is the co-op, and this game is no exception. It's now a static split screen instead of the dynamic one from the Clone Wars or the shared screen from the complete Saga. And while it's not necessarily a downgrade, not having online co-op in a 2022 game is disappointing. The co-op gameplay is also pretty underwhelming because in many fights the secondary character has a blaster and is therefore essentially useless against most bosses. And in the Battle of the Heroes, the droids are literally useless for a large section of the level. Many of the puzzles barely require the input of one player, so adding another one is just not going to be engaging. For anyone that has played a game like It Takes Two or the We Were Here series, these puzzles will look very unappealing by comparison. This is not only regarding the difficulty, but also the engagement of both players. The puzzles that do require multiple players to be solved are usually very basic, like stand on this button, but have another player also stand on a button right next to it. For this to be the core co-op mechanics is downright insufficient, especially when considering that other games from the same company that are way older offered a better experience. LEGO games always had the difficult task of retelling a story in a way that includes enough to understand what's happening, but not too much to bother the player with information they already know from the film. Generally, this was handled pretty well in the cutscenes. But what if they wanted to include more than the main plot points and iconic visuals? Well, then you get LEGO Lord of the Rings. The similarities to the Skywalker saga are very apparent. Both are open world games with side missions that retell large spanning stories with a big cast of characters and settings. But one of them handled this task infinitely better than the other. After a cutscene in Lord of the Rings, you don't have to walk very far to get to the next level, and the level variety and player engagement throughout is vastly superior. As a quick reminder, let's look at what happens after you fight Emperor Palpatine. Instead of playing the next cutscene, the game makes you play as Padme, pregnant, only to walk to your ship, fly to Mustafar, and begin the next mission. In the other LEGO games, you would start a level from the given hub world and after completing it, either return to the hub or continue the story. You would get the important information you missed through a title crawl and cutscene. Now if you wanted to tell a compelling story, this isn't much to work with. But that was never the point, because most people playing these games already know the story beforehand or just piece it together. I had this experience with the Indiana Jones game. I had only watched the first movie until that point, so when I played the LEGO game I still understood most, if not all the main story beats from the second and third film. And with the release of LEGO Batman 2, the LEGO games introduced dialogue. Dialogue is a great way to tell a story, but by far not the only one, especially if you're already familiar with the story that's being told. So having the characters talk in that case seems almost unnecessary. Lord of the Rings mostly handles it quite well and keeps exchanges to a minimum with only a few fuck-ups.
What about second breakfast?
But the way the Skywalker saga does it almost seems like the worst option you could go for. You increase the time that is exclusively dedicated to the story and decrease how much it achieves while also making it more boring to engage with. Some of the voice actors deliver a great performance, especially James Arnold Taylor as Obi-Wan, but others seem like a bit of a misfire.
Give me the map! Never. Ugh. Wait here.
I don't know if it's the voice actors who didn't care in these cases or the directors, but it's hard for anyone to turn stuff like this into gold.
Jedi dogs. Dogs? We have no such thing on Fiancé. Perhaps Woolrich would insult me more.
And even if some of the performances are a bit off, what's more important is what they actually say and when. Most conversations are drastically shortened, because otherwise the game's cutscenes would be even longer, and at that point you might as well watch the movies. I agree with the decision to cut big portions of the dialogue, but the way they did it creates another problem because some lines only work in the films because they were set up earlier or follow an important moment for a character. For example, in Attack of the Clones, Padme says the line,
I call it aggressive negotiations.
after hearing the phrase earlier from Anakin.
When I got to them, we went into aggressive negotiations.
This line was set up and paid off in a very clear way to communicate their relationship to the audience. But in the Skywalker saga, we only hear her saying the line without it ever being introduced by Anakin.
All this a diplomatic solution?
I call it aggressive negotiations.
And it's also said at a different time, so in universe, the line has lost all of its meaning because it was taken out of context. The way it is included is very forced and artificial because all of the important elements to build up to it are missing. In the story this game is telling, Padme has no reason to say this, and you can call this a nitpick, but I think it adds nothing to the game and only takes away from it. If you have to rewrite an entire scene to the point at which it has nothing to do with the original anymore, just to include one more not even that iconic line, maybe it's not worth it. The basic idea to reduce dialogue to mostly memes and other memorable lines is good, because the runtime of the cutscenes won't be bloated by unnecessary information. Examples are Obi-Wan's "Hello there" and the "Do It" alarm clock. They are only included because of memes and work because of previous knowledge players have of the franchise. "Hello there" is also said at the same time as it is in the movie, so it doesn't feel out of place like the line from Padme. But they didn't follow this all the way through. When you start to use lines that are not iconic or don't directly drive the plot forward, they have no purpose because they can't stand on their own and don't tell a complete story because of how much was cut. Also, when a scene is cut down to a third of its runtime and rearranged to bits, you have to be very careful not to damage the scene's meaning and narrative flow. The binary sunset is probably the most iconic scene in A New Hope and a top contender for the whole saga. It symbolizes how Luke is starting to give up on his dream to get away from his boring life on Tatooine. Being told by his Uncle Owen that he has to stay for another season upsets him because he always wanted to go to the academy and fight the Empire, and be part of a larger cause. But as he says himself, his life is going nowhere and looking upon the sunset only reminds him of that. There is so much out there he wants to explore, but his opportunity to make something more of himself is fleeting with every season he continues to stay. The sun is setting on his future and he is afraid that he will never make it. A pretty great scene to perfectly encapsulate how Luke feels and make him relatable to the audience. John Williams' score also reflects all of these feelings brilliantly. I think you can already infer my feelings toward this reinterpretation of Luke's introduction to the story. It's not only at the wrong time, but also has the literal opposite meaning from what was intended. The entire timeline of the first act on Tatooine is bogged. Luke wants to get home after he gets Anakin's lightsaber but sees smoke coming from his house. This is a forgivable change to speed up the story, but still not great. Then he just instantly says, "Okay, I'll leave now and become a space wizard." And then he looks at the binary sunset. When you watch the scene with audio, the tonal shift is even more jarring.
Uncle Owen! Emperor!
There's nothing for me here now. I want to learn the ways of the Force and become a Jedi like my father.
This one is very unusual because it goes from sad and dramatic to hopeful and adventurous, which is not impossible to do, but neither of these emotions get to sit with the audience for more than a brief moment. At least to a slightly longer shot and fade to the next scene where Luke has now decided to join Obi-Wan. Then we could infer that time has passed and Luke dealt with his grief. Now the binary sunset stands for him looking forward to his grand adventures in space and how he's definitely going to leave. His facial expressions seem to resemble confusion and skepticism. This is not only in contrast with the original scene, but also with the new one. This scene is not about someone struggling to realize their ambitions anymore. It's about someone who is excited to start their journey into a bigger world. Some other scenes are just as surface level as this, but at least they didn't stand in direct contrast to what they're meant to achieve in the story. How can you get every element of the scene in A New Hope wrong? You no longer have the prior scene that established Luke's hopelessness, and in this version he just experienced the death of basically his parents. He wouldn't be this calm just seconds after finding out they are dead. If we go with the Luke from the film, he would be angry and vengeful, and he literally says that he will leave now that his reason for staying is gone. But then we get the binary sunset, which stands for his fear of staying on Tatooine forever. So it goes from angry and wanting to leave to "I don't know if I'll ever leave," and back to him leaving. What we can take away from this is that there seems to have been absolutely zero concern about the storytelling, at least for this scene in particular. To make myself clear, I want the scene to be in the game. I think it's very important for Luke's character, and especially in a game that focuses more on story, it should be included. What you don't have to do is include the entire context for the scene. The scene can absolutely stand on its own, but if you include the context, you better not change it, because the time it happens in the movie is very purposeful. The binary sunset has to happen the exact moment it does to keep the emotional resonance. You can show it without context and it would still work because we know the context from the film. But you absolutely cannot act like showing the scene at a different time in the story doesn't fundamentally change its meaning. LEGO games really don't need to be focused on the story this much. All we want is to see our favorite moments retold in a cute, blocky way. And both this game and the old ones are still very good at this. But the Skywalker saga takes so much more time and does hardly anything with it. Many of the included scenes are kept in a mostly serious tone, and since they have everyone talk instead of mumble, it takes way longer to communicate the same information. And to keep the flow of a conversation more natural, they also need to add even more lines. This makes a majority of the dialogue useless because it serves no purpose. It's not trying to be funny, and if half the build-up to a payoff is missing, you might as well lose the other half too. A single facial expression in this scene communicates infinitely more than any of the dialogue that is supposed to build up to it. Even more so if the scenes were kept in the correct order. As far as I'm concerned, the visual gags are still the best the game has to offer. Poking fun at some of the corny prequel dialogue is certainly entertaining, but the more you hear a joke repeated, the less funny it usually gets.
Was there a lot of sand in your dream?
Yes, a considerable amount, but that's not the point.
What a mess! This sand really does get everywhere.
Has your brain turned into sand, Anakin?
I don't like the ocean. It's wet and murky and irritating, and it gets everywhere.
Superb. And no sand. Even better.
These are your final steps, Rey. Rise and take them.
I don't like sand.
Especially with the light-hearted tone the LEGO games aim for, much of the film's dialogue can still make it into the game as a springboard for parody. This way, you still have exchanges in the walking sections that relate to the film, but have it feel less forced. The game occasionally still does this, but not to the degree I had hoped. Much of the dialogue that is meant as light-hearted mockery felt very out of place and didn't organically rise from the story.
Hey, are you supposed to be in here?
My father controls this battle station.
Only Skywalker's allowed past this point. And you look more like a bibble to me.
Takes more than fireworks and a jetpack to defeat a Jedi.
You tell him, Master Windu.
Yes, thank you, Master Mundi. Supportive as always.
Hold your fire. There's no life forms aboard.
Hold your fire? What are we, paying by the laser now?
You don't do the budget, Terry. I do.
We're evacuating into outer space, with literally infinite directions in which to flee. However, we have decided that our transports will travel directly toward the fleet of Star Destroyers.
When we look at the two Family Guy Star Wars clips in comparison to this game, the lackluster jokes stand out even more. Family Guy manages to incorporate some of the more silly plot points in a very tongue-in-cheek way, while the Skywalker saga oftentimes just fabricates an obscure reference or brings up irrelevant ones out of thin air for the bazillionth time. Family Guy Star Wars is also better in regard to iconic moments. They wrote their own dialogue to lead to similar payoffs, and when the moment for a payoff came, they put their own spin on it.
I love you.
Fuck off.
Aren't you a little fat to be a stormtrooper?
Well, stay here and ride, you stuck-up bitch.
Blue Harvest and its sequels assume that the audience has seen the films they are parodying, and they never take themselves too seriously, which avoids the problem of tonal whiplash this game suffers from so badly. If the purpose for the new dialogue is to be fun and self-referential, what were they thinking with the rest of it? Should this help me understand the story or fill in some holes? The format of the game and big parts of the dialogue stand in direct conflict. They had to cut a majority of it for good reasons, but still keep lines that aren't relevant to anything the game is showing. What was wrong with the amount of information the older games provided? If it was too little, I don't see how the game fixes any of that. I think this is just a case of too many people with different ideas at different points in production making decisions that aren't consistently enforced.
A sitting gag. Anakin, please, you don't have to do this.
Why would they say this? What does this add to the narrative and atmosphere of the game that was previously missing? If you want more dialogue between Obi-Wan and Anakin on Mustafar, I'm sure there are some lines that would have been worthy of inclusion.
Only a Sith deals in absolutes.
You were my brother, Anakin! I loved you!
But making it so Obi-Wan now wants to talk Anakin out of being evil is just not something he would consider after what he's seen Anakin do and say. When he said,
I will do what I must.
And later,
Well, then you are lost!
It meant that he understood that Anakin is essentially dead and now replaced by Darth Vader. He doesn't take pleasure in fighting him, but sees it as his duty. This was also clearly not meant as a joke like some other lines. Or when Vader betrays Palpatine in Return of the Jedi.
I expected nothing more from the pathetic scat.
Making jokes that include dialogue isn't even something I'm against, but the way it's done here is just lazy. I just gave the example of prequel memes and how their overuse ruined some otherwise funny jokes for me. It's a hard balance to nail, but I don't think this game did it well. A lot of the cutscenes still have visual comedy, but the added voiceover is oftentimes counterproductive to the joke or redundant. Would this joke really not work without voices? So where does this leave us with talking characters in LEGO games? I think the idea can work, but only in the right circumstances. If it's a game with a new story, having characters talk makes sense, because in that story you don't have other material to understand why people are doing what they are doing. But when it comes to games that tell a pre-existing story, it's harder to do. You have a source to draw from, so every deviation has to be justified. If the choice is between this and the old mumbling cutscenes, I will choose them in a heartbeat. Talking characters aside, the game also has a big issue with pacing. Many parts overstay their welcome while others are too short or not even present. You walk around Coruscant as Padme, pregnant, but don't play the assault on the second Death Star. You are a waiter at Dexter's Diner but barely play on Jabba's barge. You walk around Arc 2 for several minutes but don't play the battle over Coruscant. You also escape from prison in The Last Jedi by sneaking into the prison guard's control room, which doesn't even happen in the movie, but you can't make a run for it in the streets of Canterbury, which only takes place minutes later and offers much more in terms of level design. You spend so much time on such minor parts while others are completely left out. The game restricted itself to only doing 5 levels per movie instead of 6 like the complete Saga. On top of that, the levels are so much shorter and can mostly be finished in under 5 minutes without speedrunning them. Combine this with the dialogue and long walking sections and you get why the game felt so empty despite its huge open world. Talking about the open world, I started looking into it after playing the campaign twice. I had kind of given up on the game, but in order to talk about its entirety, I thought I might give the open world a shot and was pleasantly surprised. It is very obvious how much effort went into designing it. The open world is made up of 24 planets with hidden Kyber bricks, data cards and characters to add to your arsenal. They are locked behind puzzles, short side missions, or time trials. Sometimes you will find a space battle going on and jump in to help either side win. I like the idea, but it feels pretty undercooked. This could have been the replacement, or in addition to the open battles from the Clone Wars, only in space. These kinds of changes would have assumedly blown the budget even more, but it's fun to think about what could have been if the new engine wasn't shoehorned in and instead of graphics, more focus and money could have gone into the gameplay. Something else that needs mentioning are the smuggling missions, and with the time trials being even challenging at times, these stand out like a sore thumb. You have 3 encounters against space pirates trying to pursue your cargo. These missions are a peak example of the game's problem with monotony. Unless you want to reach 100%, I recommend you skip these. The missions on the planet's surface vary in many different ways, going from fetch quests, to complex puzzles, to completely different puzzles, to fights, and time trials. There are ones you can find copy-pasted throughout the galaxy, but many of them are quite decent, and even if you didn't enjoy the story, exploring a planet can be very entertaining. If this level of difficulty and variety was present in the story mode, I would have enjoyed it much more. The design of the planets is also mostly very distinct and draws directly from its source material. Something I really dislike about the endgame is that after finishing the story and jumping into the open world, it is impossible to get back to the level select screen. Meaning that after completing a level, your ship first has to land on the planet, then you get your rewards from beating it, and then you have to manually go back to the level select. This admittedly only takes about 15 seconds, but it's a downgrade of the version that was already present in the game before completing the story. I would also like an option to replay a film in its entirety without creating a new save file. This is something the older games had as well. Super Story also gave you a timer so you could compete with other people or just your own high score. And that was without the sections in between levels we have in this game, so there is even more missing. Let's say you want to re-listen to some of the dialogue in Revenge of the Sith, or replay the Jango Fett encounter on Kamino. That would mean playing through all of episode 1, 2 and 3 just to re-experience that one minor bit. This is really annoying, and with the best and most creative puzzles in the story being in these open world sections, you have to wonder why this isn't just an option to select in the level menu. I would appreciate if it was possible to launch the game and just be in the level select screen from the story mode. There you can select the movie and at the bottom it says replay all. Again, this was possible over a decade ago and can be much of a hassle. The Skywalker Saga released for €50 or 60 if you wanted the DLCs. When buying the deluxe edition, I was under the assumption that this included all future content and not just the first couple of character packs. Shortly after the game's release, there was now a new so-called Galactic Edition, which was not in any of the marketing material. If you want all character packs, this would be the one to go for. I don't like how vague the trailers were in this. Many of the Skywalker Saga's character packs are also quite underwhelming with often no to minimal new voiceover or animations. The classic character pack is something that should have just been in the base game. Other Star Wars games also had Force Ghosts, which this game doesn't, and fun crossovers like Indiana Jones or J.J. Abrams. With this game's scope and already wide range of playable characters, it surely couldn't hurt to keep the fun characters from the older games. Imagine if they got both the sequel directors and George Lucas and gave them a unique ability that wasn't too powerful but just a fun gimmick. Give JJ a camera he can direct at someone to blend them with lens flare. I don't want to undersell this game's charm completely, but it leaves a lot to be desired when looking at what could be the last LEGO Star Wars game for a long time. Now to conclude, most of the levels range from bad to terrible. The new dialogue is mostly useless and often tonally confused. There's rarely a recognizable reason for any of the mechanics to be in this game, especially the skill tree and melee combat. It lacks any of the depth from other games and has no incentive to be properly engaged with. Puzzles and platforming are also about as easy as they could possibly get. Many of the new features are pointless and have a way to be disregarded. And even the more fleshed out things have little to no presence outside of their introduction. Nothing in this game stands out as particularly well designed. It's like a melting pot of potentially interesting ideas that never got beyond being half-baked. I would love to think that LEGO Star Wars The Skywalker Saga will be to kids now what the complete saga was to me and many others. But repeat playthroughs only reveal the shallowness that lies beneath the poorly told story and the unimaginative gameplay.